Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nico Krisch, and I'm the head of the International Law Department at the Graduate Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all today for this event, which we've co-organized jointly with the Geneva Center on Business and Human Rights, led by Dorothee Baumann-Pauli, who is also here and was going to speak after me. Geneva seems like a small place, but in the end, it is so fragmented that not always is it possible to make cooperation happen. But I'm really happy that we got there and that it worked also easily and fluidly. So great. Now we're especially happy that we have today Mike Posner, who is with us and is going to present his new book, Conscience Incorporated. Now, most of you will know that he is an absolutely eminent figure in the field of business and human rights, and human rights more broadly, you can say. He's been long the executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, which then came to be named Human Rights First. He has served in the Obama administration as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and the third term that now escapes me. Labor, yeah. And he is now the Jerome Kohlberg Chair on Ethics and Finance at NYU Stern School of Business, where he's also leading the Center on Business and Human Rights, and is obviously at the forefront of bringing business and human rights concerns together. The book, obviously, is precisely at that intersection. But often, when we talk about business and human rights, and those of you who have taken my course here, on it, they will know that there are obviously rather contrasting visions typically, or the discourse seems to be somewhat polarized between business interests that try to limit regulation and civil society advocates who try to maximize regulation. And the book very nicely bridges those divides, right? And shows in many ways how, in a sense, we can come to, for instance, not just a zero-sum game, but really a game where everybody wins. And in that sense, it builds bridges. It tries to understand the perspective of business and the possibilities of transforming business approaches to the relation with the broader world, with the social environment around them, with human rights and environmental concerns, and how these can feed into or be identified as business interests rather than merely as constraints. So it's a book of practical engagement, one that, I think you say in the preface, wants to get a seat at the corporate table. Now, as clearly one that wants to provide tools and approaches that can be used by businesses to further a human rights agenda. Now, not all of the more radical camp in the human rights camp might subscribe to that approach, but obviously it is one that might deliver actually results. It's also really a book of optimism. Right? One that indeed change in this area is afoot, that there is a new generation growing that both in business and more broadly in society, that sees how business cannot simply be done through the pursuit of profit, but needs to realize its greater social responsibility and in a meaningful way. Now, obviously optimism is in short supply today, and not just because of the situation in the US, but also because, for example, in the area that we're talking about, yesterday the European Parliament voted to delay and then potentially curtail the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the core piece of legislation that was meant to provide a framework for precisely those issues that we're talking about today. So, in the circumstances we live in, obviously it's even more important to hold up the flame and keep up the struggle for making the world a better place. And with that, I hand over to Doro to say a few more words about this.
Thank you, Nico, for your warm welcome and the kind introduction. And I'm very grateful that you did the more formal introduction to Mike and his work, because this allows me to say a few personal things. So I'm directing the Geneva Center for Business Human Rights, a foundation institution that we created in 2019, following the example that Mike set at NYU Stern with the Center for Business and Human Rights, the first one in the world at a business school, and creating an idea that future managers need to be taught on how to navigate and manage human rights in practice. And it's been great to be on this mission with you. I'm elated when you're around. Everybody has more energy when you're around, Mike, and this is what we need right now. I agree with Nico that these are critical times where a lot of forces are also pushing against this type of work. And using Mike's words, he says, we have to hold the line and also double down. In Europe, I think we need to double down, defending some of the fundamental values that underpin the work that we do. I'm very happy that you are all here today. I see friends, colleagues, my students, and also some people who I don't know yet. I really hope that this collaboration that we're starting today, Nico, will continue in the future. It's the first co-organized event between the Geneva Center and the Graduate Institute, and I think there's a fantastic fit, and I'd like to do this again. And happy to start today with Mike, who will first offer a few themes from his book for discussion. We hope this to be a very interactive event and exchange with you. Then Rosa Garcia, the current chair of the advisory board of the Geneva Center, will offer a first few questions about his book and Mike's work and his perspective on the US and what's currently going on there, I suppose. Rosa has a practitioner's perspective. She worked over 20 years with Alcoa, an aluminium producer, the biggest in the world, and so she's done on the ground a lot of the work that also Mike describes in examples in his book, and I really look forward to your exchange, and then after the conversation with Rosa, we will open up to you. So thank you so much. Over to you.
So thank you, Nico. Thank you, Doro. Doro, it's been an incredible pleasure for me to work with you over the last decade. I was saying to Nico that this is my second time actually speaking to an event organized by Graduate Institute. The first time was in 2009. I was in the State Department for 2 weeks, and Secretary Clinton sent me to the UN. We had no ambassador to the UN Human Rights Council. We had just rejoined the council, and there were a number of things going on that needed attention. I really didn't know what I was doing, but the respite for me was that Andrew Clapham organized an event like this, and it was, for me, the first time that I had sort of found my voice to be talking about these issues. It was a very hopeful time, and clearly I'm coming at a different moment in terms of our own country. But I do keep some optimism, and I want to talk about that. So I wrote this book it took a while, over the last couple of years. I wrote it on weekends and nights, which is not, I don't recommend if you're writing a book. It's not the way to do it. But it reflects the world as it was 6 months ago or 8 months ago, not the world of today. But I want to give just a couple of thoughts about themes of the book, and then I'm eager to have the conversation with Rosa. The book reflects what Dora and I have been working on over a decade. And the premise of it is that we live in a globalized world, globalized environment, where the biggest human rights development over the last 40 or 50 years is the dramatic reduction in poverty. In 1980, there were more than 2 billion people living in extreme poverty. And the figure I always use is that if you look at East Asia, 77% of the people were living below the extreme poverty level. Now that number is several percent. And it's primarily a China story. And what's caused the change is not UNDP or DFID or the World Bank. It's primarily jobs. And it's primarily the fact that a globalized environment has meant that there are opportunities for big business to go all over the world, for reasons of lower labor costs, productivity, et cetera. But it's resulted in a massive migration of people from rural farming to manufacturing and places and service. And so I start with that because that's the big headline of this. The world has changed in ways that have given lots of people, millions, hundreds of millions of people, opportunity to climb out of poverty. So then the question is, we live in this globalized environment. Now, what's the obligation of governments and what's the obligation of companies? And again, the sort of second thing I would say is, we also live in a world where most people, the vast majority of people, live in countries where their own governments are not doing their job. They're either not willing or they're not able. They don't have the resources to protect their own people. I call it a governance gap. And I talk about it quite a bit in the book, one way or another. This is a world where you have weak states, people living in states where their government is either contributing to the human rights violations, there's lots of that, or don't have the capacity to actually do what they need to do to protect their own people. And into that world come multinational big companies, and they are all of a sudden thrust into the middle of this world where we need global governance without global government. The UN plays some role. There are a number of important institutions here, the International Labor Organization, many others that play a part. This is a center of a lot of international activity that's really important. But at the end of the day, when Walmart goes to Bangladesh, when Shell Oil goes to Nigeria, when Glencore goes to the DRC to look for cobalt, when Meta, Facebook goes anywhere, there is this gap between what the companies are doing and what needs to be done. And companies are increasingly under pressure. This is partly your responsibility. So the book to me is about, and the subject of business and human rights is about, how do we find the right balance between what companies are willing to do and are able to do? How do we encourage that? How do we encourage making a profit and acting responsibly? How do we build those muscles within the corporate sector? And then, and Nico mentioned this, how do we get governments, the EU in particular, but other governments, to say, we are also going to play a role in overseeing this process. We're going to nudge companies. We're going to create a structure where companies know there are some standards and metrics, and there's some evaluation, and ultimately some accountability. Companies can't do this on their own, or they often won't, and governments alone can't do this, or they won't. And so we're in a kind of transitional period. The EU is going to take years, or may I say a decade, to really figure out how it wants to regulate. But it's heading in the right direction in my judgment, because there is a sense that governments have a role. The best companies are beginning to recognize this is the new reality. The new reality is you have to figure out internally how you get your house in order. And so in the book, I really try to go through, what does this mean for global manufacturing companies or mining companies or agriculture companies? What does it mean for the tech sector to act responsibly in this globalized environment where governments, local governments around the world in too many places are not doing their job? And I think it's incumbent on all of us. I am optimistic because I see progress being made, but I also see the future, a future where governments play, Western governments in particular, OECD governments, play a role in saying, we bear some responsibility, and where big global companies say, we can outsource, but we can't outsource responsibility. And so this is all about opening everybody's eyes, recognizing these are complex problems. We can't do it all. We can't do it on our own. Companies need to come together in an industry. Governments need to be smart in the way they regulate and not just stick to burdensome box-ticking reporting. We have to look at performance. We have to look at how do we actually improve the lives of the most vulnerable people in our world. I'll end with one last thought. We're obviously in a very troubling time. At least I come from the United States, so there's a daily assault on democratic institutions. We have a crisis, and it affects the private sector, it affects society more broadly. It makes the agenda that Dora and I are working on all the more important. This is not a time to retreat. It's a time to reassert our values. It's a time, if the Trump administration says, you're not allowed to use the word diversity, we have to double down and say, no, that's actually a value that we want to protect and support. It's useful to society, for companies, for governments, for universities, to have a diversity that reflects the communities where they live and operate. And so this is a moment for me to be thinking about how do we challenge what's really a kind of unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime, an unprecedented assault, and which I think has a particular resonance in Geneva, because there is so much activity here around human rights, humanitarian affairs, all of the things that we talk about in our work. There is so much important work being done here, and this is a time for institutions in Europe and international institutions, even though they're feeling beleaguered. My strong advice to you and plea is reinforce us. We have not given up hope on democracy in the United States. We're going to fight very hard to reclaim it, but it will help us if institutions here and individuals here say this is also our fight. This is a global fight to try to restore and maintain and build a stronger world that's rooted in democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Let me stop with that. Rosa, let's have it.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Mike, I have so little to say after this. I feel almost embarrassed to be here. But it's a real honor. So thank you for joining us, and thank you all for being here. There are many things that come to my mind as I hear you present your book in a very short message. But we are living at a time where, at least in the European environment, which is where I mostly spend my time, we see trust in organizations, trust in governments going down. And it seems that industry and, in general terms, professional organizations still give some level of trust. Or at least more trust than institutions and governments. So your point on the role of companies in this common responsibility is very important. So how do you see, in the world of respecting human rights and moving the needle in all jurisdictions, how do you see this work of different companies coming together, partnering for a common, better and brighter future? Is this possible?
It is possible, but it's hard. And I would say a couple things on that. One, I do think there's a value, Aurette van Heerden is here, Dora, we've all worked together for years in trying to bring apparel industry together, the agriculture industry, competitors in an industry coming together around a common standard. I think there's room to do that in every industry. And companies tend to be, not only don't trust NGOs, they don't trust their competitors. And so one of the challenges I think now, and it's especially acute, it's really important for companies in an industry to come together both to talk about their business, how are they making money, and what are the human rights challenges related to their business, and how do you create some common standards and metrics and a way to really deal with that. But there's an added challenge, which is for companies to come together and find their voice in challenging some of these more existential threats to democracy and the rule of law. I'm seeing in the US a lot of companies that are very mindful. I talk to corporate leaders who say, boy, I'm really nervous about what's going on, but I don't really want to raise my voice publicly because Trump is a bully. I have contracts with the government. I'm afraid if they're going to come after me and regulate my company. I'm trying to protect fiduciary duty. There's a lot of language that says, be careful. This is a time where companies ought to come together and form a common bond and say, there are things that go beyond our bottom line and our individual interests. We have a collective responsibility to respond and to speak out and to push back against things that actually aren't good for business. It's not good for business to have an unpredictable world. It's not good for business to have a world where you can't get a remedy in a court. It's not good for business when governments are adding tariffs on top of tariffs, which is going to bring us all down. And so commercially and more broadly, companies now are also on the firing line here. Last thing to say about trust. Trust is also achieved when actions dominate words. And I would say there are many, many instances here. We have a decade or 20 years of companies making quite sweeping promises on environment, on human rights, and their actions don't reinforce those words. Yeah. So you gain trust by acting and letting other people realize what you're doing rather than issuing a press release about something or joining a kind of pretend organization of one sort or another and then not actually delivering on the things you promised to do.
One thing that just comes to my mind and you didn't touch on, what about multi-stakeholder programs? Is this a tool that could help bringing together industries, overcoming these concerns about competitors and competing on the same space and credibility trust as well?
Yeah, and again, I'm going to come back to the Fair Labor Association. Oret ran the FLA for 13 years. Dora and Oret worked together. It's an organization now, 50 companies, 40 in the apparel, clothing and athletic shoes, 10 in agriculture. It took years of struggle to get the companies even. When we started, Nike and Reebok and then Adidas were sort of in the room and they couldn't even sit in the same part of the room. And if one said something, the other would kind of cringe and say, that's not right. Okay, so it takes companies a while to adjust the notion. You can compete on having the best product or the lowest price or the fanciest, box that your stuff's coming in, but you shouldn't compete on human rights. There ought to be a place where companies recognize this is a common interest and the world is better if there's a consensus among the industry leaders that this is something we ought to be working on. That's the first element of trust. And then we had, from the beginning, NGOs like Oxfam and me. I was with an NGO at the time. They say where you stand depends on where you sit. We came in as NGOs. They came in as companies. We had universities. We all had different interests. And it took a long time before people let down their guard and said, this is not a gotcha organization where you're going to be telling some inner secret of what the company's doing, and it's going to be on the front page of a newspaper the next day. And it took years to the place where you actually could see people interacting in those three groups in a way that created the space both to acknowledge problems, to deal with them honestly, to hold the companies accountable, but also to provide help for them to improve the way they operate. So I think the model does make sense. And again, coming back, Nico, to the European, institutions, European Union and CSDDD, all of the things that are now being debated, I think there's some lessons learned from that experience that can actually be helpful for governments trying to think about these things. I think you have to do it industry by industry. What's good, when you talk to Meta, it's very different than when you talk to BP or Shell, which is very different than when you talk to mining companies. The interests are different. The issues are different. You need industry, standards, metrics. You need some way of evaluating that's honest. And then you need some form of accountability. And that model, I think, over time, I'm hoping, will be part of what the European architecture starts to look like.
Yeah, and you mentioned that before in your speech, and Nico as well, the efforts of the European Union to bring some formalized structure to the due diligence, to the responsibility beyond your fence, right? To make companies accountable for everything that happens since the sourcing of the materials till the final product. And I would say it makes sense. It makes sense. I don't know what the mistake of the European Union was on how this was established. I read the first drafts. Probably you all did here in this room. I sit in the board of several companies, so the first draft actually had the board members as responsible, directly responsible, accountable to ensure that this due diligence process was well established and was effective. Now what we see is that this is delayed. You mentioned that even at some point in time could disappear, the approval of this, the deployment of the directive. It was already approved. I just wonder how much of this is related to what you just mentioned. You have the VPs and the big companies, but you have, I don't know the number, but very high percentage of companies in Europe are small and medium enterprises and not big ones. So I don't know if the issue comes from the bureaucratic side of it. We were too far without the proper differentiation between different types of business. But how do you see this in the short term and in the midterm? Do you see this evolving, disappearing? I can't believe it's going to disappear. So I just have some hope. How do you see the future of this regulatory environment?
It's not going to disappear, and it's going to evolve not in a straight line. And it's not going to happen next year or in 2 years or whenever they're now saying. It's going to happen over a decade or more. And it'll constantly evolve. And part of it will be trying to figure out, the companies are now saying two different things to regulators, to governments. They're saying on the one hand, we don't want to be burdened by regulations. We don't want to spend too much time doing audits. We don't want to have too many reports. But then when somebody suggests something more ambitious, to actually hold them accountable with some consequence to a standard, they say, oh, no, we don't want that either. So you sort of we're going to have to navigate that. And I'm very sympathetic to a company that says, oh, there's multiple regulations in Europe, they're contradictory, they're confusing, it's causing us to be not competitive. I get all of that. And I think there's probably way too many reporting requirements. There are people working now, that's what they do, they fill out reports, and that's not a great thing. But on the other hand, there's also companies pushing for the notion, we want to define due diligence as we do a CSR report, or we do a sustainability report, or we have human rights on our website, or we have a team working in ESG. Those are process things that are important, but they're not sufficient. And so the moment we start to move from process to outcome or performance, then we're having a real conversation. And those are hard. They're hard, there's expense, we haven't figured out, how many tiers down the supply chain you go. We don't have very good data. There's a thing called Pearson's Law, which says that which is measured improves, and that which is measured and made public improves exponentially. And so Walmart can tell you to the can of green beans or the shirt on the rack in Ohio, how many shirts have been sold in the last 2 hours. But they have no idea where the shirts are produced.
I'm sure.
And so we need to be honestly looking at how do you make this a business priority? Anything that's a priority to business, they measure. You know this because you've been in the newsletter. Productivity, efficiency, worker retention, profitability. Those are things that are priorities, and people's jobs depend on meeting the number. Human rights needs to be that kind of a priority. We're not there yet, but with some help, hopefully, from European regulators, some help from enlightened companies that will say, okay, this is coming. My advice to a company is don't wait. This is coming. It may not be in 2 years or 3 years, but it's coming. Get yourself ready. It's not easy. Start going down this track and start gathering data, figuring out what, again, don't outsource responsibility. If it's how you're making money, then you need to be paying attention to what's happening at the end of the chain.
Well, let me tell you something. Today is a big day for me. After 25 years working for an American company, I think it is the first time that I hear from an American person. Thank you to the European regulators. My goodness. It's my big day. It's my big day. Thank you, Mike, for that. So there's still hope that Europe is helping some good purpose, even if maybe we have gone a little bit too far. But also sharing some personal experience here. 25 years in the mining and metals industry. And as you say, profitability, I don't know what, all those numbers that are key for the executive team and for the board. Until one day somebody calls in the morning and says, oh, you know why? What happened? Our mine in the middle of the Amazon has been stopped by the local communities. Right. And what does it mean? What does it mean is, well, you know, we have lowered our stocks of bauxite to the minimum level. This is working capital. It's one of those indicators that matters for the business. Yeah. So what does it mean? It means that we have bauxite for 3 days. So we need to fix this problem and make sure that we have the mine back in operation in 3 days. Otherwise, we might need to declare force majeure with customers. Okay, so what is the problem with the local communities? And you know, the problem with local communities, most of the times, is not an engineering problem, it's not an investment problem, it's not even a financial problem. It is that we have costs in their eyes and to their principles and livelihoods, some problems that are hurting their livelihoods. There are costing them some deficiencies of some order, access to water, access to land, ability to feed your family, or even following their religion, their beliefs, their local customs, whatever it is. So in my 25 years experience, yes, human rights stop operations, not paying the right attention to this. So when we talk about measuring what matters to the business, and in particular, talking about this European, the deception that we have because we are deceived because this is not happening through hard law, I do still believe that companies are looking at risk. And again, I sit in different boards of directors, and there is not only one, and different type of businesses, commodities and technology and whatever, that is not looking, and it doesn't have supply chain reliability as one of the top 10 risks that the audit committee is looking at on a monthly basis. So based on that, with or without regulation, there has to be something, right? Because all of a sudden is a business fundamental as well.
Yeah, look, I agree with that, and as I said a little bit earlier, government regulation will never solve the problem by itself.
Yeah.
Companies have to internalize, this is part of what we do. And they will do it, in some cases, it's changing the culture. It's changing the way companies view this. It's prioritizing. Economists talk about externalities. Economists view environment and human rights as externalities. I hate that word. Yeah. It says it doesn't really matter. Lawyers talk about fiduciary duty or materiality. They're talking to investors, and I work 2 miles from Wall Street. People in Wall Street are still wedded to Milton Friedman, who wrote an article 50 years ago saying the only thing that matters is short-term shareholder returns. If we don't move beyond that to think about a longer-term view and recognizing you can be very profitable, but maybe a little less profitable if you do the right thing. That's a change of culture. It's very hard to change that. But at the end of the day, there are costs. People talk about triple bottom line, do well, do good. No, it actually costs money to do the right thing. We acknowledge that, and then say in the long term, it is in the best interest of businesses to do this, but you can't take a 3-month view. You have to take a 5-year view, a 10-year view, and invest up front to make sure that you're doing the things. Again, how are you making money? What's your core business? And what are the most serious human rights challenges related to that business model? And what is it going to take to correct that?
I totally agree with you. And there is one more piece, if I can add, Mike, is that, when you get into an engineering problem with a product, with a car, with Airbus and Boeing get in trouble all the time. They have to call back airplanes and all that stuff. But, in 24 hours, everybody knows this is going to take us 6 months to resolve. It's going to cost us $5 billion, and that's the end of it. When you get into a human rights related issue, the key problem is you have no idea how long it's going to take you to resolve it. You have no clue what the cost is going to be. And it's going to take you a huge amount of time, maybe years, just to define what the real issue is, because it's not that evident to put a frame into what a human rights issue is. And again, in the mining industry, unfortunately, we have plenty of those. So that's another good reason to focus a bit more on doing the right thing beyond the quarterly report to Wall Street. I wish they could just change those quarterly reports of listed companies into something that give us a little bit more time to breathe.
My worst nightmare as a business professor is an article that Milton Friedman wrote in 1970 in the New York Times Magazine. It basically says shareholder supreme, all that. They teach it in almost every class, finance class at my business school. And when I got there, I'm going, what is going on here? And, I'm looking around and people have read this article 6 times. And every time I go into, they say, what about Milton Friedman in 1970? And I say, he's been dead for like 40 years. Let's move on. We're in the 21st century. So the ghost of Milton Friedman.
And I'm actually super happy to the fact that Doro, I discovered this Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights through Doro, and my friend Mark, I'm destroying the room, and my friend Mark that is sitting back there, I'm happy to hear that there are students of Doro that are here. I wish, I'm a pure and simple engineer. I'm just a basic industrial engineer. I didn't know anything about human rights when I got into the mining industry, and I wish I had had the possibility to go through some fundamentals at a business school. So lucky you, and to those that are involved in this type of teaching, please just continue this, because sometimes this is business fundamentals, but it saves and it reduces risk to business, any sort of business, by a little, certainly. Anyway, I'm derailing from my, I'm
Can I just say one thing about that? It's also important, this is also a question of morals or values. And business leaders, are confronted with all of these complexities and all of the challenges. I interviewed a guy some years ago, who was also an engineer. His name is Brian Krasinski.
Engineers are good people.
Yeah. He was the head of a company called Intel. And they were rated by an NGO called the Enough Project, dealing with conflict minerals in the Congo. And there were 60 companies rated. They came in 33rd. The Enough Project wrote a letter to this guy, the CEO, and they said, we can actually help you. And he shows it to the lawyer of the company, and the lawyer says, throw that in the wastebasket as quickly as you can. He shows it to the public relations person, throw it in the wastebasket. His whole executive team said, just ignore this. It'll go away. And he says to me, I interviewed him, he says, I went home and I said to myself, I'm an engineer. I've been with this company 32 years. This is a problem we can address. And he came back and he told his team, I'm ignoring everything you tell me. I'm going to call the Enough Project. And 2 years later, they were #1 on the survey. They actually put some time and energy in. It didn't bankrupt the company. They're having their own problems now, but not because of that. And it was essentially a moral judgment or an ethical judgment. He said, I'm running this company, I want to do it the right way. So it can be done, and when that happens, it makes a huge difference.
Totally agree. Well, I have to wrap up because I think I have to give you the time to ask your own questions, but there is something that I have to ask before I leave this table. The US and Europe and the US and the never-ending story of the level playground for companies. And, you know, from my CEOs and my boards, I always get the same question. Why should we get into this if nobody else is doing it? And with the new perspective, at least for the next 4 years in the US, in terms of general directions, how do you see this evolving, this space of ESG, social freedom, and the rest of it that goes?
So just a couple of sentences. You know, I'm pained by what I see going on in the US. Donald Trump and Elon Musk and the cast of characters they have around them don't believe in liberal democracy. They don't believe in the rule of law. They don't believe in everything that's happened over the last 80 years to build an architecture where the United States and Europe together build something that's good for all of us. And so there's a retreat, talk about lack of values or lack of a moral compass. We're experiencing just the opposite of that. It's the chaos theory of government, and it's also a theory that, you know, you can deregulate everything and that's going to be good for big business and the hell with everybody else.
Yeah.
So we're in a terrible place. I want to put that out there directly. It's also true that, and this is something I just wrote about, we live in a world where you can't just be an American company or a European company, you're a global company. And when one, either Europe or the United States regulates something, it has an effect on everybody. And the example I just wrote about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, it was adopted in 1977. Why? Because there was a study done by the US Security and Exchange Commission. They interviewed 200 American companies and they had paid $300 million in bribes. And so they had a hearing in the Congress, and Gulf Oil and Chiquita Bananas, companies, big companies came and they said, please regulate us, it's in our interest.
Wow.
That became not just a US regulation, it became a regulation for global companies. And so when Siemens, a big German electronics firm, had hundreds of bribes, having nothing to do with the United States, they were brought to justice, brought by both the Justice Department and the SEC. They paid $800 million. That was a wake-up call, and now you have the British anti-bribery law, you have OECD regulations. We're seeing the opposite now with the Europeans taking the lead. And if you're an American company and you want to do business in Europe, you're going to have to figure out what the hell is going on in Brussels and what's going on in Germany, what's going on in France. And that's a good thing. I welcome that. We need, again, global governance without global government, and that means the strongest governments in the West, US and Europe in particular, Australia, Japan, they need to be stepping up and setting that floor for what corporate conduct ought to be.
I totally agree with you. So I think this leaves us with quite a positive angle to it, right? We talk about partnerships. Companies still can do the right thing, coming together for the bigger good. Let's put it this way. We talk about regulations with the hope that Europe will not lose track and still, if at a lower speed, still continues to drive the behavior in the right direction. And hopefully this will influence others. So all good here. So just say that by listening to you, Mike, over the last 30 minutes, I'm eager to read the book. So it's right outside for those of you who haven't read it yet. So thank you for your time. And I think we leave the space to everyone in the room to raise your own questions, comments, or share whatever you want.
I must have said something that offends somebody here.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentations. You've not spoken about beauty. You've said a lot about regulations and costs. And in the back of my mind, I have the life cycle of a beautiful flying butterfly, an insect. That butterfly begins life as an egg, and I'm thinking of the world after World War II. It goes through a crawly, buggy kind of life cycle, and then there's that metamorphosis stage, which for me was the Ruggie era Ruggie was the centerpiece about a decade ago. What I'd like to hear from you is about what the beautiful future looks like with the behavior of the companies and the structure of governments being oh so complementary that this is a beautiful oil painting. It's not a reporting exercise, it's not a hassle, it's part of the unique selling proposition of each and every company. Could you say something about the beautiful future? You put lots of colors on the cover of your book, so you or your publisher have given some thought to beauty, but I'd like to hear, Michael, about beauty in business.
You're pushing my optimism to a new level.
Let's not call it business and human rights, let's call it beauty and human rights.
So here's a thought about where we've come from, where we are, and where we're going. In the 1990s, even into the early 2000s, a lot of global companies benefited from chasing cheap labor or finding minerals someplace. And they would say, you know, we follow local law. These are not our problems. We don't own the mine. We don't own the factory. We don't own the farm. We follow local law. And the local laws were not sufficient. So in 2011, John Ruggie spent 6 years developing these guiding principles on business and human rights. And it basically said, okay, it's still primarily the duty of states to do this, even though we know they're often not doing it. And companies have some responsibility to do something. Details to be determined. And Professor Ruggie said at the time, this is the end of the beginning. And in fact, it opened up the space for this discussion we're having today. But it didn't really get at the essence of where we now need to go. And so the future to me, going back to something I said, is that we need some combination of responsible governments and working in partnership and sometimes nudging companies to come together in each industry and figure out what are the key human rights challenges related to how we're making money. Again, no more outsourcing of responsibility. Let's have substantive standards. So right now, the outgrowth of the Ruggie principles, which is in the European regulation, is a concept of due diligence, a little squishy for my taste, because every company gets to sort of have a discussion about what they think due diligence is. And it's actually counterintuitive to me, because due diligence is a management term. It's used by companies to, when they buy another company, they want to make sure there's not a hidden lawsuit or some impropriety financially. Here, governments are saying to companies, tell us what your human rights due diligence risks are. Well, if a company doesn't want to spend money or doesn't want to really dig deep into how they're acting, they're not going to come up with the real list. And so we need to be moving from due diligence, in my judgment, to actually looking at substantive standards. It'll be very different from Meta than it is for Alcoa, than it is for Nike. Industry standards, metrics, you need to put meat on the bones. What does it mean? And then you need to have some serious evaluation of performance. And I give a lot of, it's going to take time. I want an on-ramp. You can't go from 0 to 60. You need companies to kind of get with the program. But at the end of the day, if companies are massively non-compliant, they need to be held accountable in the way that Siemens was held accountable. There needs to be a price tag for non-compliance. That's where we're heading. And companies, what I just said, most companies will cringe. Oh my God, you serious about this? Yeah, I'm serious. That's where we need to head. And it'll take a decade, or it'll take 15 years, but we can get there.
Well, thank you very much for the very interesting insights on the book. Well, personally, I've been following the business and human rights for some time already, and I've been checking the NYU news, etc., and I find them very insightful from the business perspective. And I think it's very interesting to think about the future, but maybe something that we haven't touched upon, it's thinking a little bit about the past. So my question, it's more coming from the victim's perspective, in the sense I would like to know what's your view on accountability of victims, in the sense of which ones you consider are the best avenues for victims that have suffered from business and human rights violations, and your view on the challenges that they are facing to hold companies accountable, especially thinking about big supply chains that are doing their activities in different regions of the world, like Latin America or Africa. So I was wondering, what's your view on this?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hard question. The third element of the UN guiding principles, the Ruggie principles, was remedy. And it's in many ways even less well-defined than the responsibility of companies to respect rights. At the end of the day, you start by saying remedy ought to come from governments, from courts. Again, most people live in countries where the courts are not going to provide that remedy. So then you have to figure out what's next best. And, multi-stakeholder organizations have some sort of an answer to that. But we're dealing with mega problems here. And what the real answer to your question is 193 governments that are protecting their own people and provide a remedy. National remedies are the best. But we're not there yet. That's even a longer conversation than the last one. And so I think at the end of the day, at this stage, we don't live in a perfect world. But you start to say, who's got the greatest ability to change the reality on the ground so that those victims are not suffering? Dorothy and I yesterday were in Berlin talking to Volkswagen, biggest European car company, biggest European company, I think. We're talking about cobalt mining. Dorothy's done 2 fantastic reports on that. Cobalt mining in the Congo, where there are several 100,000 workers, 25,000 kids working in informal mines, and every one of the auto companies and the electronic firms say, oh, that's terrible, that ASM, informal mining, but that's not our problem. We only use cobalt from mechanized mines. So those people, the kids that are going down those holes, and the people that are suffering, the victims, are not going to go to the Congolese government for relief. It's the responsibility of the biggest buyers, the people who are building cars, who are using that cobalt for their batteries. And they need to begin to say, we need to invest in creating some structure to formalize those ASM sites, to give people protection, to keep kids off the mine. You can't say it's an inconvenient truth. You can't say that's somebody else's problem. And so I think for me at least, right now, the long-term answer to your question is 193 governments. The immediate term is, how do you get Volkswagen or Tesla or any of the big auto companies, Tesla in particular, I would say, because I'm not so happy about their owners. But how do you get auto companies to say, this is our problem? We can't pretend that we're not involved in this ASM mining. And then we have to figure out, how do we invest to make sure that people are not being victimized?
Michael, thank you very much, yes, for your words, and actually I'm happy to hear that, because I'm working for Swiss Better Gold, very much involved in artisanal mining. And actually, your comment is very relevant because in this context, this is my question, in the context where we can see regulations slowing down a little bit, there are still two factors which are, to me, still are very, very important drivers in terms of progressing with human rights. One is transparency, and the other one is reputation. I would like to see your views in terms of these two concepts as really as a very strong force to push companies to continue to do the right thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, the issue, I'm glad you raised the issue of transparency because it's so often the case that these things are going on in remote places and it's easier not to know and it's easier not to make it public. And that's the starting place. I'm dealing a lot with the tech companies right now, for example. And, you know, they won't even tell us how their algorithms work or aren't open to the discussion of how you change the structure, the design of those algorithms so that they're not just promoting hate and violence and disinformation all the time. Opening the door to the discussion requires, and again, this is where I keep pointing at you as though you're the European Union. You raised it, I'm sorry. You start where governments need to be demanding that companies provide more information, that they open up the door. Once you open up the door to that discussion and you have real facts, it changes everything. So I agree with both points. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Long-term admirer of Professor Posner. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act used to be the standard, and as I understand it, it no longer is. Can you comment on the importance of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act?
Sure, and Mike Parmalee was a champion of human rights in Geneva for decades, working with the U.S. State Department. So thank you, Mike, for your service. The piece I just wrote was really in response to a decision 3 or 4 weeks ago by the Trump administration to say we're no longer going to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is insane to me. I mean, again, it was created in response to companies coming to Congress and begging for a law that said you're not allowed to pay a bribe to a foreign official. It was congressional pressure coming from the private sector. And so now the new mantra of this crowd is to say, oh, this is anti-competitive, it's not necessary, etc. Nobody who ran a company, a Fortune 500 company in 1975, is still running a Fortune 500 company. I will say most of them aren't alive. And so if you really want to go back to 1973 and say we're going to open up the doors to foreign officials to put out their hand, that's what we're going to do if we abandon the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But again, there's British law, there's OECD regulations. The fact that the US government now says we don't care doesn't mean the idea of government regulating transparency and an end to corruption is going to stop. It won't stop. But I think that this is what I'm looking for: fissures where the administration is making stupid mistakes. This is one of them. And where we can begin to build some resistance coming from places they don't expect it. And this is one, I think there are going to be companies that are going to say, we know full well what's going to come if we're not abiding by this law, and we don't want to be in that position. It's helpful for us to have the government say you can't do this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good to see you. And I want to talk a little bit about your book. You've been very humble at this talk today. I read it immediately, and if you did it at nights and weekends, you did a fantastic job because it read itself. And I literally couldn't put it down. One of the things that struck me was in your remarkable career and long career, you've dealt with horrendously difficult problems at a human level and an institutional level. And you talk about it in the book. And you do it with a sense of optimism and the sense that the humanity will prevail in the end, that I found overwhelming. And and then the inauguration occurred in January, and the world is turned upside down since it's been published. Are you optimistic? Should you be optimistic? And will there be a second edition of the book addressing the president in the future?
I don't think the words Donald Trump are anywhere in the book, by the way. Yeah, I'm optimistic, but cautiously optimistic. And I'm optimistic only if everybody plays their part in challenging what's going on now. What's going on now is not normal. It's really an assault on 80 years of building an international structure that is rooted in human rights, democracy, rule of law, development, all of those things. And so now we've got a wrecking crew that's come in and said, we don't believe in any of these things. We take a kind of cynical view that these institutions can be torn down. A group that believes that the transatlantic partnership is not worth it, that believes that they can act in a transactional way for their immediate self-interest, and that's going to be okay. It's not okay. There's a number of things that I think are beginning to happen in the United States. I would say in the last 2.5 months, people have been shell-shocked, a little paralyzed, terrified. Trump's a bully. He will show every time if you cross, he's like a little child. He's not a healthy human being. If you cross him, he's going to come at you. That's his MO. That's what he stays up late at night looking for people who don't like him. And there are a lot of people that don't like him. But I think we're going to prevail, but we need to be more organized internally. We need more moral courage from leaders in the business sector, in the universities, in law firms, in the religious institutions. They need to be more organized. We're going to get there, I think, because at a certain point, we're going to cross a threshold and enough people would say, this is not what I signed up for, and we will start to fight back. We need people in Europe and elsewhere to reinforce that. We can't do it on our own. And so, there's all kinds of immediate destructive effects of what they're doing, reducing money to international organizations, the tariff war. We go on and on about the many ways. And again, we talk about victims. The people who are going to suffer the most are the people who have the least voice and who are going to be, it's the person who's not going to get the retroviral vaccine or drug in Lesotho or someplace. Nobody cares about them in Washington, but those are people already that are suffering. So we need to be immediately reactive to the things that are crisis urgent, and then we have to take a somewhat longer view to say, how do we turn this back, turn these people out, and then build back in a way that actually may make more sense. The United States has dominated a lot of international organizations. Grand bargain. U.S. pays, U.S. sets the tone, U.S. sets the agenda. Europe, Japan, Australia, we need more engagement from other countries to pay more costs and to be part of a joint set of creating an agenda that really is a mutual agenda. At the end of this, if the transatlantic partnership is anything, it should be stronger because we'll be operating in a more mutual way rather than having some U.S. agency come and say, we'll pay for it and stay out of the way, we'll tell you what the agenda is. So to me, that's also part of long-term optimism. If we can get there, then that will be a huge step forward.
Good.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm a big fan, working with the Center for Sport and Human Rights here in Geneva. My privilege is that it's my day-to-day job to promote respect for human rights with all actors in the world of sport, in particular sport bodies. And it is a very new topic for all these organizations. It's not like mining, the extractive sector, traders, apparel. This is 10 years old, and for other companies it's much older. The trend I'm observing is clearly a request for clarity and a request for indicators. And sometimes what I also see is that organizations develop their own indicators without really taking into account the key due diligence steps outlined by the UNGPs. And as an outcome, we see people suffering. In the world of sport in particular, people with disorder in their sex development, transsexual people, many other groups. You mentioned before the need to move from human rights due diligence to standards, which I completely understand, and this will make my job much easier. But how do we ensure that we do not lose the key elements such as real meaningful stakeholder engagement, thorough risk assessment of the risks to people, by moving from the complex human rights due diligence steps to a set of standards that apply to all industries?
Yeah. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's where we have to be aiming. You have, and I'm a big fan of your organization, Mary Harvey. I think you're trying to do the right thing all the time. You have two big challenges, which I'm going to tell you, and you're going to tell me I agree with you, I think. One is that the sporting bodies, IOC, FIFA, are a disaster. They really are. They're reactive, and they are constantly finding ways to avoid this subject or creating kind of half-serious review processes that are not actually dealing with the problems. The second is the corporate sponsors, including some that you're working with. And they will say, oh, we have a package of 10 events, and so we can't really speak about the fact that the World Cup is going to Saudi Arabia. Why is it going to Saudi Arabia? Because they paid for it. And that's not good for workers. There are going to be hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of workers from South Asia going to Saudi Arabia. They're going to pay their own recruiting fees. And then they're going to spend a year trying to pay back the loans. Why are we not? Why is Coca-Cola not saying something about that, or Nike, or Adidas? So those are the challenges. And I think at the end of the day, it's great that you all are in the mix, but you have a tough job. You have a tough job. The sporting associations are nowhere near being reformed, and the sponsors are too willing to go along. That's my honest opinion.
Thank you very much, Professor Posner. Very inspiring and refreshing to hear you in these turbulent times. I'm a PhD candidate in international law here. My question is related to the question of Foreign Corruption Act and the response you provided to the colleague of 193 countries. Yeah. So in particular, what's the role for responsible governments in promoting implementation and enforcement of domestic regulations? And if I can develop a little bit my question, Rosa mentioned that sustainable value chains are not hard law today, and in a sense I understand where it comes from, but at the same time you have domestic regulations. For instance, a mining company is obliged not to dry a river when it operates in Argentina, Bolivia, or Chile. And you said that these 193 countries is something to do afterwards, but do you think that governments, responsible governments, can things to do? For instance, I'm thinking about IMF conditionalities. Are there avenues for these responsible governments to foster and to promote implementations of these domestic regulations that already will contribute towards more sustainable corporate activity? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. A couple of different answers to that. One, I think it's often the case that, as you're suggesting, there are national laws in many, many countries, in the more developed world, OECD world, and in the developing world, where governments are not being pushed hard enough to uphold their own laws. I think of a place like Brazil or India. Those are big, powerful countries. They have laws, and they made a judgment to maybe not enforce them or to enforce them irregularly. The Brazilians are doing better in that respect. But there's plenty of room for there to be an internal domestic discussion about how that ought to work. And so, I think some of that is happening, but it's not happening fast enough. I was struck in my own government in the days of Obama and Hillary Clinton, which is a far stretch from where we are today, that there were very few U.S. officials who were trying to pay attention to or regulate how U.S. companies operated. In the U.S., maybe, yes, OSHA or things, occupational safety and health. But globally, no. And so what the government did was promote exports, balance of payments, or they would talk about private-public partnerships. And so one of the things I did when I went into government was to say, why are we looking at Walmart and Exxon and all these U.S. companies that are operating globally? And it was like, oh, yeah, should we do that? That's not really what we do. So there were a lot of issues where everybody would race to be involved, and I would do these issues, and all of a sudden I'm like chairing the voluntary principles on security and human rights, and I'm meeting with I'm doing all this stuff because nobody else wanted to do it. So we built a little unit, which I'm sure is being torn apart now. But yeah, I think there's plenty of room, both in the developing world and in bigger Western countries, developed countries, to be much more attentive to what's the best way to resolve anything. The best remedy is for national governments to take responsibility. And we don't have to wait theoretically for 193 governments. Let's take each government where we find it and try to figure out what's the art of the possible. It's really important.
Yeah.
Mike, back in the last century when we were discussing whether you could get companies to fill the gaps left by governments, fill these governance gaps. And I remember Dora wrote her thesis on public actors delivering private goods. Private actors delivering public goods like respect for human rights and health and safety and so on. And at the time we were saying that's a stopgap measure. As ultimately we need to get governments to do their jobs, right? But 20 years went by and governments still weren't doing their jobs, and the onus on companies to do it was even greater. But because of the voluntary nature of all of that, it just wasn't moving the dial, right? So the activities were too inconsistent, too sporadic, and so on. So the European Union decided, okay, let's formalize this, let's make it law. That looks like it might come undone at exactly a moment when the world is getting more uncertain and more dangerous by the day. So it seems that the onus on companies to deliver those public goods is greater than ever before, probably even greater than it was in the 1990s. But there's less pressure on them to do it. At least, the narratives are so dispersed at the moment that the only groups who can bring that pressure right now are civil society, and they're under attack, right, in a big way, even in Europe. So I see two options, really. One, either we can convene and get companies to come to the table and actually look at how they could do this collectively, or we go back to more adversarial tactics, court cases, campaigns, that kind of thing. Where do you think things are going, and how do you think what can people do to get the more constructive options in play?
Yeah. Not surprisingly, a hard question, but a really important one. I would say a couple of things. There's not one answer to that. It's all of the above. They're probably, well, again, here's a little bit of optimism to your scenario. People are more aware of these issues than they were in the 90s, or even 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There's a generational change. There's more young people. I see it at my school. Young people who are coming out of school who want to work for a company that they feel good about. They don't want to be embarrassed with their friends. And so, and a lot of corporate leaders I talk to say, you know, we can't avoid these issues, even if it's not our most comfortable issue. What environment easier, but human rights much harder. We can't avoid these things because the best graduates are asking these questions. We want to hire them and we want to retain them. So that gives me hope. There's a generational change and it's heading in the right direction. Secondly, there's more tension. You know, what barrick mining does in Papua New Guinea 30 years ago, who could find Papua New Guinea on a map, much less worry about their gold mine? Now somebody has a cell phone and they put it up there and all of a sudden there are people demonstrating in Toronto in front of their headquarters. So there are things going on in spite of everything we're talking about. There are trends that say, A, this is more visible, and there's a generation that's paying more attention. Having said that, we're up against it with governments, certainly the US now, fast moving backwards, deregulation. The Atlantic Ocean just got a lot deeper and wider. So the US is going to be part of the problem, not part of the solution for at least the next 4 years. And on the European side, the EU is not exactly a well-oiled machine. And so it's bumpy. There's going to be back and forth, 2 steps forward, a step and a half back. It's not going to happen overnight, but we have to keep pushing. And the most enlightened companies that realize this is the way the world's going ought not to be undermining Brussels. They ought to be saying, we actually need this because it's in our interest over the long term to have a level playing field. If we're going to be serious about it, we want everybody to be serious about it. So, and then, some litigation, some, NGO, raising the flag, all of that. We need to do any and all of that all the time and double down. This is the time to double down.
Yeah, thanks. Really fascinating. Thank you so much for your talk and the conversation. Kind of sparked lots of ideas and questions in me, but I'm going to limit myself really to one.
Okay.
Interest of time for now. Kind of your question just now kind of picked up on my interest in sort of how to increase the perception of risk of companies so that they actually get spurred into doing something. Because of course we've had 30 years of this discourse, and somehow, kind of by many accounts, something has changed, but by way not as much as should have, and simply hoping for enlightenment among corporate leaders is not likely to cut it. So in increasing the pressure, increasing risk costs probably has to come about somehow. But you've answered that. My question goes to the role of governments, and you said, and rightly so, right? There are 193 governments that can do something all on their own. Now, obviously, these governments operate today in a pretty different environment than they operated some decades ago. And I think the European directive, right, is an example of that. Of course, Europe is no longer, jointly with the US, just sort of undisputed centers of global markets, but instead they see themselves as much more subject to competition and therefore worried about competition. So the 193 governments are all operating in a competitive environment, just as companies operate in a competitive environment, and that increases the collective action problem that they have. So how can we get at that, right? How can we get like-minded, or kind of reasonably like-minded governments to come together and form some kind of alliance to overcome the problem that each on their own will say, well, no, let's not impose too many costs on companies operating in our market or from our market, because that's going to disadvantage them. Like people now say with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, right? Chinese companies are not doing it, so why would we, right? So how can we overcome this problem? And I'm also asking that because, of course, in Geneva here, kind of every year now for the last 10 years, there have been negotiations about a treaty on this, right? A legally binding instrument. It hasn't really delivered the results that we would hope for, but to an extent you would think, well, if you want countries to be able to create a level playing field, something like that, right, was traditionally an answer. Now might not be the answer, but where else would we go?
Yeah. Let me take the last part of your question and work backwards. I don't believe a global treaty on business and human rights is really going to ever happen or be the answer. It's too, again, I come back to the notion of every industry being different. Every government is in a sense the same. So when you have a treaty on civil and political rights or rights of women, every government is basically doing the same thing. Every company is not doing the same thing. You can have rules on carbon emissions and every industry is doing the same thing. They're either emitting carbon or they're not. But if you're talking about privacy or disinformation in big tech, that's a very different conversation than manufacturing. So the idea you're going to have one treaty that's going to cover all of that, I think, is almost impossible to really carry out. It's the debate's gone on for 10 years. It's also clear that neither governments, most governments, nor companies want that. So even if it happened, though, I'm not sure that it would solve the problem you're talking about. I think the answer part of the answer, you mentioned China. We haven't talked about China. China's offering an alternative to the world. It's saying, we will provide economic opportunity and development, but it's ethics-free, it's values-free. You don't have to worry about environment. You don't have to worry about human rights. And so if governments in countries where those things matter to the population are serious, they've got to provide an alternative that says, no, these things really do matter, and we are collectively going to try to figure out a model that both provides economic opportunity and economic potential, business potential, economic development, and at the same time, we have some values. We have there's some core, there's a floor, there's things you just can't do. Child labor, forced labor, you pick the issue. There are things that we feel strongly enough as a society or as societies, we're going to come together around those things. And we've made efforts at that, but again, we haven't gone far enough. And I think this is, again, for me, everything is doubled down. This is the time for the EU, for the OECD to say, if we don't get this right now, we're going to wind up in a world dominated by governments, especially the Chinese, that have a very different worldview. And again, I'm not saying every Chinese company is evil or every Chinese official. I'm giving you a broad sense that that's, I think, the model they're pursuing.
Questions keep coming. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I know everybody else is doing.
Yeah. There's again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for all the great insight. I wondered if you could say something more about the kind of internal dynamics of the company. So you had the anecdote you gave earlier about the lawyer and the public relations guy giving different advice. And somewhere in this, it feels like the kind of internal dynamics of companies matter, right? And there are going to be different dynamics within different companies. You look, for instance, at tech companies, and they seem, there's been a lot of kind of changes of positions when Donald Trump's come in. And I wonder if that's just an industry thing, or does it matter because there are different, particular groups of people populating particular groups of companies in particular sectors? Do you have any kind of insights about what makes a kind of strong human rights company from the inside?
Yeah. I've said a couple of times that, when human rights becomes a priority, there will be a sense coming from the top of a company, this is something we really do. We're not kidding. And right now you have, in a lot of companies we deal with all the time, a dichotomy between the ESG office, the sustainability office, who tend to be quite enthusiastic about human rights and environment. And then you have the people doing operations, the people doing sourcing, the people that are basically running the company for the CEO and the C-suite. And those two camps don't talk to each other, or they talk to each other uncomfortably. Or, more importantly, the operations people don't listen to the sustainability people. You see that all the time. And that can only be resolved when boards or the CEO or the people running the C-suite say, no, 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 we actually mean it. And when sourcing people come to human rights meetings and they say, we have a lot to learn. Doesn't happen very often. So that's the first thing. The tech sector is a whole other thing. Watch this space. The reason Mark Zuckerberg and all those characters, the tech bros, were sitting in the front row in the inauguration is that they want to destroy the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. That's a #1 priority. And it'll be the first European regulation that the Trump administration goes after. I don't know what the quid pro quo, because there's always quid pro quo, but they're going to make some pretty steep demands. We've seen it with the Digital Markets Act in the last couple of days, I think with Google. You're going to see those companies full force coming into Europe to say, enough. You can do it some other industry, but don't mess with tech. We don't want to be regulated. We're smarter than everybody else. We're libertarians. We know what's good for us. And the last thing we want is Europeans to tell us what to do. So that's going to be a hell of a fight. And I hope Europe stands up and fights back.
Yes, hello, Claude Retzmann from Procter & Gamble. First, thank you very much for the presentation and for the introduction, which put forward the fact that employment has raised a lot in the last decade, thanks to multinational companies as well. So a very important point to remember. Also, I really appreciated your lucidity, I don't know if you say that in English, about the needs of the multinational companies. I think that's very important and not always recognized or accepted, adopted in the NGOs. I think it would be best for a dialogue if this would be this starting position of really understanding each other. I have a question which is probably stupid or provocative, you will judge. I'm not an expert at all in human rights and due diligence, but I had the feeling today, the impression that maybe even the CS3D would not be enough for, when I say for you. So my question is, are we prisoner to UNGP OECD? Is it enough? Should there be a next step so that some of performance indicators that are developed so that we go one step further? So I would hate to see that you do CS3D and in 2 years, the expert like you tell us it's not enough really, you should go a little bit further.
So I'm glad you asked that. You know, the CSRD, the reporting requirement needs to be rethought. I'm actually quite sympathetic to businesses who say it's too confusing, there's too many reports, there's too much, auditing that doesn't get us anywhere. We're wasting time and money. It's inefficient. Okay. I think those are all fair criticisms. And so then the question is, how should you do it? And I would love to see big companies come in and say, we agree with the principle of what you're trying to do here. We agree that there has to be better performance. And now let's have a discussion of what kind of data, again, I come back to data. Data drives decisions. What kind of data would be helpful for us to know that governments can regulate or governments can demand greater transparency? And how can you help us move from where we are to where we need to be? It's very hard. You have big supply chains. You have lots of practical questions about how far you go in terms of, the levels of your suppliers. Let's have an honest discussion about that. What's realistic? What's a realistic timetable? How do you develop reporting requirements that actually help companies get better data about things that will lead to better performance? That's the discussion we should be having. But it's so often, again, lack of trust, a lot of posturing. And so nobody wants to acknowledge what we have now or what's being proposed isn't good enough. Let's smush it together and hope somehow it'll work out. No, it's not going to work out unless we actually talk about what information do investors need, consumers need, companies themselves need. That when we get that data, we're going to have a very different conversation.
Do we need only CSRD to be provocative?
What's that?
Do we need only CSRD then?
No, I'm not sure. I'm not so wedded to I'm not, who am I? I'm coming from far away. I don't really know what the right answer is in terms of structuring that, but I am clear, again, about you need standards, and I am clear that there needs to be a reporting requirement of companies. You can't expect companies on their own to figure it out.
Professor Posner, thank you so much for sharing the insights of your book with us. I am a master's student of responsible management. I am actually part of Professor Dorothy's class on business and human rights.
You're lucky.
Yes. And my question is related also to reporting, which is how do you think the corporate governance sector could move away, or rather move beyond the voluntary and non-binding aspect of reporting of business and on human rights? As part of the master's program last semester, we reviewed many reports related to sustainability and on financial reporting, and this seemed like companies are making positive impacts at the beginning, but then looking more deeper, they don't actually touch on the important matters and material matters. It's more superficial. And also now with the omnibus launched by the European Union, this gives companies more time to report, I think from 1 year to 5 years, and also a shorter scope to report on to have due diligence on their suppliers. So how do you think we could deal with the non-binding matter?
Yeah. So I think in different ways I've said, I don't think voluntary reporting is enough. There needs to be some pressure coming from government, some obligation coming from government. But I'm also mindful of how hard it is to start with nothing and build a system that's sophisticated and really get at the problems. So I'm willing in a negotiation to say it may take 5 years. You need an on-ramp, and governments and NGOs both need to be giving companies some guidance and some support in how you actually do it. A lot of the reporting is not useful. A lot of it is duplicative, it's inefficient, but that doesn't mean you stop reporting. And it doesn't mean that the governments ought to stay out of the way and let companies decide what due diligence is. That's never going to be enough. And so I say, let's regulate it. Let's have governments demand certain data be available, and then be honest and realistic about how long it's going to take, and give them the support to actually do it in a serious way. Those that are serious ought to drive the train. The companies that most are committed to this ought to set a standard for what that looks like. And we ought to be reinforcing them and giving them credit. One of the things we haven't talked about at all is the investment sector. There ought to be investment funds, we've written a report about this, that actually look at data about who are the best companies on environment or on diversity or on labor supply chains, and find investors who care enough about those issues that they're willing to take a lesser financial return. There ought to be, we call it a values fund. There ought to be values funds that allows investors that really care, gives them the information, who are the top 10 manufacturing companies in terms of carbon footprint. I want to invest in those companies. Right now, most of the ESG investment funds are really similar to the commercial funds that are coming out of the big firms. They use the term, and what they say is, oh, we're evaluating risks to our investors, but not to people on the planet. They advertise one thing, what they're doing is something else. We need to give companies that are doing the right thing incentives to do the reporting, to gather the data. Government's got to obligate it. Investors have to reinforce them.
Yeah, I'm
at the end of the hour now.
Yeah. If you allow me, from a very humble position, CSRD touches my heart because I've been living in parallel to CSRD for a while, now in different jurisdictions, but certainly in Europe. So just a general question. Everybody knows the general accounting principles, right? I don't know when they were put together. 20 years ago, 30, 40, I have no idea. But at the time when they were put together, maybe some companies thought, what a waste of time. Really, do we need to do all of this? Amortization, I don't know what, leasing, whatever. I mean, the CSRD, considering that the CSRD, first of all, is a reporting scheme, is a very short side of CSRD. When somebody is asking you to tell about the past, you're reporting. When they ask you to tell what your key risks going forward are, what is the CapEx you're going to dedicate to those, what are the objectives that you're going to set for those, this is about strategy. It's not at all about reporting. They are asking you to talk about the future of the company. So you have to think in two ways about the CSRD. One is that they are giving you a general accounting principles for everything that is not finance. This is the first thing, which will keep us, a lot of us, out of trouble. Mm-hmm. And the second piece is that they are giving you a framework to really deep down into what matters to your business through a materiality assessment, focus on those things that bring value to any of your key stakeholders or that put the business at risk in front of any of those stakeholders, and allow you just to focus in those and set targets and report on those. So this is my caveat. I need to break this little... yeah, but that's the point. It's not a reporting directive. Trust me. Anyway, I think that just have to say that. Sorry about that. But I think it is 2:00. I think this is the time that we had allocated. It has been an incredible couple of hours. Thank you so much, Mike, for your generosity in sharing all this knowledge, experience, and also your views of the future and your optimism, more than anything else, with all of us. Thank you all for joining. The Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights has a lot more resources in terms of papers they write that are available on the website, but also training they do and so on and so forth. So please, we are delighted to bring to the mainstream all those parts and pieces. And just thank you for hosting us. Thank you, Doro, for organizing it. And once again, please, a big applause for Professor.